All right, settle down, everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to History 101. Today, we are diving into a massive, comprehensive explainer on a truly cataclysmic era, the Great War. From 1914 to 1918, the globe was essentially engulfed in a conflict so huge, so utterly unprecedented, that people at the time literally couldn't comprehend its scale. I mean, think about it. We're talking about a generation that rode into battle on horses and left it in armored tanks. It's a staggering shift. Today, we're going to break down exactly how the world plunged into this madness, who was actually fighting who, the incredibly grim realities of the battlefield, and how the end of this war completely rewired global politics forever.
Here is the syllabus for today's explainer. First, welcome to the Great War. Second, we'll look at the 4 root causes. Third, drawing the battle lines. Fourth, the reality of the trenches. And fifth, the treaty and its aftermath.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1. Welcome to the Great War, 1914 to 1918.
Moving right along to Part 2, the 4 root causes, or as it's often called, the powder keg of Europe.
Now, I definitely want you to get your notebooks ready for this part, class, because before 1914, Europe had basically turned itself into a giant powder keg just waiting to blow. There were 4 interlocking ingredients fueling all this tension long before anyone even fired a shot. First, you had this incredibly rigid, complex web of military alliances. Basically, if one nation got attacked, treaties legally dragged everybody else into the fight. Second, rampant nationalism. This dangerous, competitive pride led to some serious aggressive posturing. Third, imperial rivalries. Major powers were just fiercely competing for overseas territories and global dominance. And finally, all this paranoia sparked a massive global arms race. Countries were stockpiling weapons and expanding their militaries at an absolutely terrifying rate. So, you've got those 4 explosive elements, right? Alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and an arms race. At that point, literally all you need is a match. And that violent spark happened on June 28, 1914, right on the streets of Sarajevo with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Because of those rigid military alliances we were just talking about, this single assassination triggered an unstoppable domino effect. It just rapidly ripped the major powers of Europe into an all-out war.
Let's look at Part 3, drawing the battle lines and these global alliances. Let's examine the board.
This was a massive but surprisingly fluid global theater. Over on one side, you have the Allied powers, initially anchored by the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, but look closely at how the timeline shifts here. Russia actually bows out of the conflict in 1917 because they're dealing with their own revolution at home. Meanwhile, Italy joins the Allies in 1915, and the United States finally enters the fray much later in 1917. Facing them down were the Central Powers, a totally formidable coalition of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. This constant shuffling of these massive, sprawling empires is exactly what took a regional European crisis and blew it up into a true world war.
That brings us to Part 4, the reality of the trenches and the dawn of modern warfare.
I want to pause for just a moment here. Let this staggering number really sink in for the entire lecture hall. Over 16 million people died. The scale of the slaughter was, well, it was something the world had never witnessed before. This absolutely wasn't the quick, glorious campaign that all these nations had promised their citizens. It was a prolonged, deeply mechanized tragedy.
The main reason for that massive casualty rate, and really the defining symbol of World War I entirely, was trench warfare. Men on both sides dug these vast, deep networks of trenches directly into the earth, creating this brutal, unmoving stalemate. It completely changed the fundamental reality of combat. Soldiers were living, fighting, and dying in unbelievably grueling conditions. They were battling thick mud, rampant disease, and staring out at the terrifying expanse of no man's land, often sacrificing thousands and thousands of lives just to gain a few measly yards of dirt.
Now, what's really interesting about this part of the explainer is that the devastating effectiveness of those trenches was driven by terrifying leaps in military technology. For the very first time, soldiers were facing the true industrialization of death. We're talking about the introduction of armored tanks, rapid-fire machine guns that could just mow down charging lines of infantry, horrifying poison gas attacks, and military aircraft bringing death straight from the skies. This right here was the terrifying birth of modern mechanized warfare. Finally, let's open up the last chapter of our syllabus, Part 5, the treaty and aftermath, the bitter peace. Let's trace the chronological milestones to see how this all wraps up. The war rages from 1914. By 1915, Italy joins the Allies. Then, 1917 is a huge pivot year. The US enters the chat, and Russia leaves it. All these shifting weights finally tipped the scales, leading to the ultimate collapse of the Central Powers. The fighting finally, thankfully, ceased on November 11, 1918, with the signing of an armistice. The guns of Europe finally fell silent. But as we know, an armistice is really just a ceasefire. The actual political settlement, that was a totally different beast. There is a very stark contrast between the military end of the conflict and the severe diplomatic reality of the peace settlement, most famously the Treaty of Versailles. The victorious powers imposed unbelievably harsh, punishing conditions specifically on Germany. We're talking massive financial reparations and the infamous war guilt clause. It wasn't just about ending the war anymore. It was about systematically crippling the loser.
Which brings us to the most vital takeaway of today's lecture. We know from our historical sources that the extreme conditions forced on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles directly fed into a whole new wave of tensions across Europe. So I'm going to leave you all with this lingering, pretty provocative question to chew on. Did this peace settlement actually fail to bring peace at all? Did the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles essentially just set the stage and guarantee that World War II would happen? I want you to think critically about that as you review your notes tonight. Thank you so much for joining me in History 101. Class dismissed.